This is an adaptation of a presentation that I gave to the University of the Third Age, which is a group of older South Australians, retired or semi-retired, who meet together and hear from experts about a range of different subjects. I've adapted it because I gave this talk in 2013, and there's been some movement and further information since I gave it. The thing that has stayed the same though is that every day in Australia 6 babies are stillborn. So an outline of the presentation was that I was talking about the current state of play in Australia compared to the rest of the world, telling them how they can protect those that they love from stillbirth, and also acknowledging that because there were more than 50 people in the room, it was very likely that many of them had been touched by stillbirth. Stillbirth, for those of them who weren't aware, is the birth of a baby in Australia at or after 20 weeks gestation. Some other countries have different definitions. Who shows no signs of life at birth, and there is also a birth weight definition which is included in that for Australian purposes. I showed this slide which was relevant at the time, talking about prevalence rates in high-income countries and asking them to notice the difference between the best performing, or the so-called best performing, and the so-called worst performing. This is the best, these are the worst performing countries across the globe as far as high-income countries go, as a way of saying if we could all be amongst the best performing countries, then we would save a lot of babies' lives each year. Problem is, we actually don't know why some of those countries are performing better than others, and some of the things that they are doing to make that a reality for them. So I have a dream, and my dream is that we will reduce the number of stillbirths in Australia from currently 6 a day to more like 3 a day, which is still obviously an awful lot. But that really accounts for those stillbirths that we have a chance of preventing. What needs to happen to make my dream a reality? Well, I think that the thing that really needs to happen is awareness. There needs to be public awareness that stillbirth happens. The pregnant woman herself needs to be aware of what to look out for and ways to protect herself during pregnancy. And importantly, and the reason why I give talks like to the Third Age, is that community members need to also be aware and act to inform and protect the pregnant woman and her baby, not in a paternalistic manner, but in a way that gives her information that she perhaps herself doesn't have. But we have a pretty big problem, and that's that we don't talk about stillbirth in our culture. And there's a range of reasons for this. It could be, it is a taboo subject. There is a silence around this subject in our community, which makes it difficult to talk about. There is a thought amongst certain people and certain cultural groups that it's only a baby, and so therefore is to a degree replaceable. There is superstition that if you mention the word stillbirth, that it will occur to you. There is certainly stigma around it, and I have a PhD student right now who is looking at stigma and stillbirth, but she's found that a large percentage of her participants experienced stigma in some way, shape or form, probably the saddest of which was keeping away from other people because they felt that they might contaminate them, or that stillbirth was in some way catchy. And then there's a helplessness. We can't really prevent it. We don't know how to prevent it. And so therefore, let's not talk about it. I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll see that that's actually not true. And there's also a range of other reasons that are likely exist as to why we don't talk about stillbirth. I think that why we don't talk more is that many of us are resigned to the fact that there's not much that we can do about it. But in actual fact, that's really not true. There actually are a number of things that we can do about it and that have worked elsewhere in the world. It's good to make a comparison between SIDS and stillbirth, because SIDS has no known cause still, even after all of the research that we've done on SIDS. We believe that it's probably multifactorial causes that cause SIDS. There's no one thing that causes it, and there's potential to make people anxious and upset with talking about babies who might die. Similarly with stillbirth, there is no known cause. Even if you have a cause, you don't really have a cause for the cause, because most of the causes of stillbirth are associated with live birth as well. For example, if the baby is born with the cord around their neck, and that is thought to have caused the stillbirth, there are plenty of babies who are born alive and well each and every day with the cord around their neck. Similarly, if the baby is growth restricted, many babies are born alive every single day across the globe who are growth restricted. So even if you have a cause, you don't necessarily have a cause for the cause. It is probably multifactorial, and we certainly, there are many people who believe that there is the potential to be making people anxious, upset if you talk about stillbirth. The SIDS triple risk model is a good one to look at because it talks about a critical development period, an exogenous stressor or a stressor that lies outside the body, and a vulnerable infant. And together, for some babies, that leads to SIDS. What they've done in the SIDS prevention way is working out how to protect the vulnerable infant. And this is important because they've actually figured out a public awareness campaign, so everybody knows put your baby on their back to sleep. It's a pretty simple, doable message. And as a result, we've seen massive reductions in SIDS deaths worldwide. If we take that into the pregnancy arena, we believe that placental or fetal vulnerability exists. There is something about the baby who dies that makes him or her different from the baby who can survive with the very same thing. And sometimes that's related to a perfect storm, if you like, occurring with a fetal stressor and maternal factors that together, for some babies, and thankfully it's only a few, ends up with stillbirth. But we certainly have plenty of vulnerable babies born alive, if sometimes not all that well, but certainly alive. Fetal stresses happen all the time and don't necessarily result in stillbirth. Maternal factors like her weight, her smoking status, her lifestyle factors, and the list goes on, can all contribute and load into this perfect storm to cause a stillbirth in some babies. The great thing is that the unborn baby is capable of letting us know that they are okay, and the biggest way that they let us know is through changing their movements or altering their movements. So this slide, a quarter of women who present with decreased fetal movements have adverse pregnancy outcomes, mainly growth restriction but also stillbirth. Nearly half of the women who experienced a late-term stillbirth in one study presented with decreased fetal movements at some time in their pregnancy, compared with only 9% of live-born control. So it's certainly a symptom to be aware of, but obviously it's not something that causes stillbirth, but it's associated with stillbirth. Can awareness of fetal movements be protective against stillbirth? Well, we think that it is, and this study by Grant and others conducted way back in 1989 certainly gives us hope that that's the case. It was a large multi-centred international randomised controlled trial with lots and lots of women involved, all risk groups. At that stage they did a count to 10 versus a usual care as their intervention, and they found, interestingly, no difference in stillbirth across the groups. But then they noticed, actually a few years later, that the stillbirth rate fell across the cohort from an expected 4 in 1,000, which was the rate in the countries that participated at the time, to only 2.8 per 1,000, which is a very good rate even in today's terms. But we have quite a problem because there are two myths that are widely held in the community and really need to be addressed by making talks like this to community members like yourself. So the first is that it's normal to feel less movement towards the end of the pregnancy as the baby runs out of room. That's a very commonly, widely held myth that's held across lay people and also healthcare providers, unfortunately. It is not normal to feel less movement towards the end of pregnancy. The baby actually, running out of room is not something that happens to the baby. Certainly they are confined, but the thing is that as the baby grows, they're growing in strength. So the movements shouldn't change in frequency, certainly. And in some ways, if the baby is really quite close to the surface of the womb and the abdomen, you should be able to feel those movements, in fact, stronger than less. So thinking about that logically, it actually doesn't make sense to say that the baby moves less close to term because they're running out of room. A healthy baby, will continue to move strongly and frequently throughout the pregnancy. The other widely held myth is that if the baby isn't moving, that a way to get the baby to move is for the mother to drink a cold, sugary drink or eat something. And again, that's not really supported by logic because the cold drink is supposed to shock the baby awake as the cold drink hits the stomach. But the stomach is actually a fair way away from the uterus, even at term. And of course, as soon as the cold drink enters the throat or the mouth, it becomes at body temperature. So by the time it actually reaches the stomach, it's well and truly at body temperature and isn't going to be able to wake a sleeping baby. A sugary drink or eating a meal is thought to wake the baby by giving the mother a load of glucose, which will then be transferred to the baby. But again, that doesn't make sense because the mother has her own way of mopping up the excess sugar. Her own pancreas will do that work before it has a chance to go over to the baby. So unless she has a faulty pancreas and is perhaps diabetic, that's not going to work either. And it's been shown in a number of studies that even if you do a sugar infusion for the mother, that it doesn't make the baby move. So two myths that don't work. I wanted to talk briefly about the STARS study because the STARS study was a large cohort study where we got information from more than 1,700 women from across the globe, those who'd had a stillbirth more than 3 weeks ago. And we also did a case control element to that particular study where we looked at differences between what the mothers who'd had a stillbirth said about their baby's movements and what women who'd had a live birth said about their baby's movements. And there are actually quite substantial and very stark and quite obvious differences. So I've summarised them on this slide. Sorry about that little icon, I cannot get it to move. The baby, the first one in the cases is the baby generally moved less towards the end of the pregnancy in a very slow sort of manner. So there was a slow drop off in the amount of movement that the baby had in each and every day. Whereas the controls were much more likely to say that their baby had had one quiet day that perhaps concerned them, and then the baby returned to their normal pattern of movement. The cases as a group were very likely to say the baby was less active towards the end of the pregnancy, and the controls said that their baby was more active towards the end of the pregnancy. This is interesting. 40% of the cases reported that their baby's movements were less strong, using words like slow and weak. And interestingly, the exact opposite number of the controls reported that their baby's movements became stronger, using words like powerful and stronger. So that's important because women don't only talk about reduction in frequency. They also talk about reduction in strength. We've known for the longest time that babies who move less close to term are at increased risk of stillbirth. And in this particular group, we found that they talked about decrease quite a lot. 80% of them talked about their baby decreasing in frequency. Then we have the controls, on the other hand. Some of them talked about a frequency decrease, and that doesn't mean that it was normal, simply that their baby survived. If you think about that triple risk model, these were maybe the babies who didn't have that perfect storm. They just moved less, and that's what caused them to survive. But we had a frequency increase in this group, so they talked a lot about their baby moving more and strongly. Then, most interestingly of all, I think, is that when we asked women to describe a time when their baby was more vigorous than usual, 48% of the cases use words like wild, crazy, ballistic, nuts, bananas, berserk, erratic. Whereas cases used words like powerful, strong and aggressive to describe this time. And not only that, they talked about it happening regularly, whereas the crazy, wild, ballistic, nuts people talked about it happening once. So very different experiences between the two groups. So I want to pose these questions. What would you do? Your daughter rings you and she says, I'm worried baby isn't moving as much as normal. Or your daughter-in-law rings you and says, my baby just went crazy and I feel frightened. Your sister rings you and tells you how her pregnancy is going and she says, oh, it's so cute, the baby has just started hiccuping all the time. Or you bump into your pregnant relative at the shopping centre and she says, baby must be getting ready for birth, he's not nearly as strong as he used to be. All of these things are signs that the baby may be unwell. It's not a certainty, but these are certainly signs or symptoms that the baby could be in trouble. So the thing to do with all of these is the same, which is why I've got them on the same slide, and that is that you should encourage your relative or friend to get their baby assessed as soon as possible by their maternity care provider. Whoever is providing their maternity care, they should get in contact with them and get their baby assessed, because the baby may be in trouble. I say may, it's by no means a certainty. So very quietly and gently saying, that concerns me. Can you please make an appointment to see your maternity care provider? Two more things that we think women can do to protect themselves from stillbirth is listen to that maternal intuition and avoid going to sleep on their back. Looking at the STARS study again, we asked this question: during the pregnancy, did you ever have a gut instinct that something was wrong? And interestingly, we had a large number of the people in the uncontrolled cohort and an equally large number of people in the case control arm of the study tell us that yes, they did have that feeling. The other thing to notice is that many of them said that they had a gut feeling about something being wrong throughout the pregnancy. And they said things like, yes, I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. I told my mother, partner, sister, friend, and they reassured me that I was just being anxious. So that was a really common thing that was said to us in the data. Granted, there were some women who said that they felt there was something wrong once their baby started to move in a different manner, or that they had it right before the baby died. And in some cases, of course, that may have been because the baby had actually died and they hadn't been assessed yet. And there was also a gut feeling associated with something specific occurring. So if they were told something during the pregnancy which worried them, they might then have reported a gut feeling that something was wrong. This was interesting because it was almost entirely confined to those people who'd had a live birth, that particular theme at the bottom there. So if your loved one said to you, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I just feel like something is wrong, then the best response, or the response that we would suggest that you give to that loved one is, tell your care provider and get yourself checked out, so that you have maximise the chances of everything being okay and the baby being alive and well. So I mentioned sleep position. There is now an awful lot of research internationally that points to the fact that if the mother goes to sleep on her back, she's something like almost 3 times increased risk of stillbirth. Now that might not seem like a lot, or it might seem like a lot, but it's certainly a very simple thing to say to the woman, settle to sleep on your side. Don't worry if you wake up on your back. That's okay. It's perfectly normal to change positions while you're sleeping. But the important thing to do for your baby is to settle to sleep on one side or the other. It doesn't matter which side, one side. The last thing about this is the physiology that might interest you. If we look at these bottom 2 diagrams, you can see that when mother is on her side, these 2 blood vessels are open, and when she's on her back, the vena cava in particular gets squashed by the weight of the uterus and the unborn baby. We think that that's the mechanism for the death. So it's long been recognised that maternal sleep position can compromise fetal well-being. Avoiding the settling to sleep position is now emerged as a possible modifiable risk factor for stillbirth. Further research is needed and is underway, but meanwhile pregnant women probably should avoid settling to sleep on their back. So what I would like this to achieve is public awareness of stillbirth, letting pregnant mothers know that advocating for her baby begins during pregnancy and that she's not being silly or paranoid or anxious if she expresses concerns. And I think we need to make it everyone's responsibility to listen to and support the pregnant woman to immediately act on any concerns that she might have during pregnancy.